You're listening to Portfolio, the property law podcast from Davis Blank Furness.
Hello and welcome to Commercial Property Insights, the podcast from Davis Blank Furness, where we unpack the legal complexities of commercial property in a way that's practical, accessible, and genuinely useful for you, our listeners. I'm Rosie Korcz, a partner in the commercial property team. I focus on transactional work, helping businesses, SMEs, and high net worth individuals navigate property acquisitions, disposals, and leases.
And I'm Seán Hackett, head of the property litigation department here at Davis Blank Furness. And whilst Rosie is dealing with the deals, I'm often picking up the pieces when things go wrong. Disputes over lease terms, forfeiture proceedings, dilapidations, claims, that sort of thing. It's a different perspective, but both sides of the coin are crucial to understanding commercial property properly.
Absolutely. Today we're discussing a topic that affects almost every business tenant at some point: alterations to commercial premises. Whether it's fitting out a shell unit, reconfiguring office space, installing signage, or simply putting up some shelving, tenants need to understand their rights and obligations when making changes to their leased properties.
And from my perspective as a litigator, this is one of the most common sources of disputes. Either the tenant carries out works without consent and faces forfeiture proceedings, or they do the works with consent but then face massive dilapidations claims at the end of the term because they're required to reinstate, that is, put the property back to its original condition. And I've seen businesses facing six-figure bills because they didn't understand their obligations at the outset.
Exactly. And for SMEs and business tenants listening, or their accountants and advisors, this is an area where proper planning at the start can save enormous costs and heartache later. So, let's start with the absolute basics. If you're a business tenant and you want to make alterations to your premises, can you just go ahead and crack on? The answer is, unless the lease prohibits it, you can. Most commercial leases, however, contain covenants restricting alterations. Now, these range from absolute prohibitions, which will be phrased as not to make any alterations whatsoever, to qualified covenants, as in not to make alterations without the landlord's prior written consent, all the way to fully qualified covenants. Now, these would say not to make alterations without the landlord's prior written consent, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld. The key thing is that you look at the wording in the lease and see exactly what it says regarding alterations.
If the lease says you absolutely cannot make any alterations, then that's fairly rare in most commercial leases nowadays, but it does occur. Well, that's the end of it. They cannot do them. That's it, full stop. The landlord's got no obligations to even consider giving consent, and if the tenant goes ahead and carries out the alterations anyway in breach of the covenant, the landlord can take forfeiture proceedings to terminate the lease. However, that is not the entire picture, because a tenant may be able to apply to carry out improvements by following the process outlined by Section 3 of the Landlord and Tenant Act of 1927.
Now, this is a really important piece of legislation. Yes, it's been around for nearly a century, but it still applies to modern commercial leases and provides real protection for tenants. The key point is that alterations must be improvements. If they are, then, by virtue of Section 19.2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, the landlord's consent to carry out the improvements cannot be unreasonably withheld.
Yeah, so let's be clear about what Section 19 subsection 2 does and doesn't do. It applies to alterations that constitute improvements. If the tenant wants to do something that's clearly an improvement, for example, installing better heating, upgrading electrical system, creating a more efficient layout, putting in disabled access facilities, improving energy efficiency, and the lease has a qualified covenant against alterations, the landlord must act reasonably. The landlord can't refuse capriciously or for reasons unconnected to the landlord and tenant relationship.
Yes. But here's the qualification, and this is crucial. Even with Section 19.2 protection, the landlord can require, as a condition of giving consent, that the tenant pays their costs of dealing with the application. They can pay compensation to it for any diminution in value of their reversion, and they can make them reinstate at the end of the lease. So the tenant might get permission to make improvements, but only on the basis that they'll have to undo them when they leave. Whether that's reasonable depends on all the circumstances, the nature of the works, the impact on the property, and whether they're likely to be useful to a future tenant.
Yeah, and I labour that point so that there's no confusion. Section 19, subsection 2 only applies to improvements. If the tenant wants to make changes that aren't improvements, perhaps dividing up a space in a way that's more convenient for them, but might not suit a future tenant, or removing features that most tenants would want, then Section 19, subsection 2 will not apply. In which case, if there's an absolute covenant against alterations, and what is proposed is not an improvement, then that's the end of the matter. No alterations can be carried out, full stop.
Okay. If the alteration covenant, however, is qualified, so remember the wording was not to carry out alterations without the landlord's consent, and the alterations are improvements, then, by virtue of Section 19.2 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, that consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. Again, because they're improvements. If the alteration covenant is qualified, i.e., not to carry out alterations without the landlord's consent, however, the alterations are not improvements, the landlord is free to refuse to give consent. Section 19.2 of the 1927 Act does not come into the equation. And if the alterations covenant is fully qualified, i.e., not to carry out alterations without landlord's consent, such consent not to be unreasonably withheld, then the landlord can only withhold consent if it is reasonable to do so. Okay, if we pause there, can I ask you to say a bit more about the tenant improvements under the 1927 Act and how tenants might be able to seek compensation?
Yeah, sure, because this is something that's not utilised by tenants quite as much as you might expect. The Landlord and Tenant Act 1927, particularly sections 3 to 9, offers a statutory framework designed to balance the tenant's needs to improve the property with the landlord's interest in preserving its reversionary value. And the Act enables a tenant to do the following: apply for consent to make improvements, obtain compensation for certain improvements at the end of the tenancy, or require the landlord to undertake the works themselves in certain circumstances. And while the Act is now nearly, as you've said, 100 years old, it remains a live and sometimes underused tool for commercial tenants. And before turning to how the Act works, it's essential to understand what counts as an improvement. Now, the Act defines improvement very broadly. Section 12, subsection 2 says it's any addition or alteration of the holding, and this goes well beyond mere repairs and can cover things like structural alterations. So if you stuck in new walls, mezzanines or extensions. It also includes modernisation, so if you've got new air conditioning or wiring installed. And it also includes functional enhancements like new lifts or better insulation to shop fronts, things like that. Now, whether something is an improvement depends on the perspective of the tenant, not from the landlord.
So assuming the works are improvements, how does a tenant go about engaging the Act?
So under Section 3 of the Act, a tenant can serve a notice of proposed improvements on the landlord describing the intended works and then seeking consent. And on receiving that notice, the landlord has effectively three options. The first one is can consent to the works, possibly with conditions that you mentioned, for example, requiring the reinstatement at the end of the lease, complying with statutory regulations or supervision by the landlord surveyor. The second is that they can undertake the works themselves, so the landlord can agree to execute the improvements at their own expense, or, and this is the third one, they can object by serving a notice of disapproval, specifying reasonable grounds for refusing that consent. And if the landlord fails to respond within 3 months of the notice, the tenant is entitled to compensation for the improvement works proposed and then undertaken. And if the landlord objects within the 3 months of the notice, the tenant can apply to the tribunal for permission to carry out the works. The landlord may only object on reasonable grounds, which might include things like structural risk or potential damage to the building, adverse effect on the value or its appearance, breach of planning control, or an adverse effect on other tenants or the landlord's ability to let other parts of the building. Unreasonable refusal may result in the tribunal granting the tenant permission to carry out the works under Section 3, subsection 4. Now, a separate but related protection lies in sections 1 and 2 of the Act, which deal with compensation for improvements made by the tenant during the tenancy. If the tenant has carried out improvements with proper consent, either under an express term in the lease or under the statutory procedures that I've just talked about in section 3, then the tenant may be entitled to compensation when the tenancy ends. And the compensation is designed to reflect the increase in the value of the holding to the landlord as a result of those improvements. Now, it's not reimbursement of the costs, but the benefit retained by the landlord when the tenancy ends. So in practice, the sum can be calculated as this. It's the amount by which the improvements have increased the letting value of the holding at the end of the tenancy, subject to certain limits and exclusions. And valuers typically determine this by comparing the rent the property would command with and without the improvements. The tenant must serve a notice of intention to claim the compensation not more than 3 months and not less than 1 month before the tenancy ends, and that's under section 4, subsection 1. And if no agreement is reached on the compensation, the dispute can be referred to the court or determination by arbitration. And the tenant can't claim compensation for some things. For example, improvement works carried out in contravention of the lease, i.e. without consent, or works required by statute or local authority, or works for which the landlord has already compensated the tenant, or works which have ceased to add value by the tenant's end date.
Okay, you mentioned that the landlord could undertake the works themselves.
That's right. So when the landlord is served with a tenant's notice proposing those improvements, the landlord can elect to undertake the works themselves instead of granting consent to the tenant. And this gives the landlord control over the building's integrity whilst still enabling the tenant to benefit from those improvements. And if the landlord chooses this route, they must carry out the works at their own expense and do so within a reasonable period of time and ensure that the results meet the tenant's reasonable requirements. Now, that mechanism is particularly useful where the improvement, for example, installing a new lift or a fire alarm system, benefits both parties or affects the structure or the common parts. And if the landlord fails to carry out the works within a reasonable time, the tenant may apply to the court for an order permitting them to proceed to undertake them.
Okay, that can be very useful, particularly where the lease provides that a tenant may undertake improvement works as opposed to being obliged to undertake them. And the tenant in those circumstances could give notice under Section 3 and seek compensation. But that's a discussion for another podcast. I thought we ought to cover the point before we moved on. So, picking up where we paused, dealing with a tenant's application for consent to alter and the landlord not unreasonably withholding consent. The question often asked is, what counts as reasonable?
Yeah, that's a tough one now. The answer as to whether it's reasonable is always fact-specific, but the courts have established various principles over the years. A landlord can reasonably refuse consent if the alterations would diminish the value of the property or the landlord's reversion, and that's their interest in the property. They can refuse if the works would be structurally unsound or breach planning or building regulations or create risks to health and safety. They can refuse if the alterations would increase the landlord's insurance premium significantly or make it more difficult to relet or sell the property in the future. They can refuse if the works would affect other tenants in a multi-let building, for example, creating excessive noise, vibration, or obstructions. But the landlord can't refuse for purely capricious reasons that have nothing to do with the property or the landlord and tenant relationship. Refusing just because you don't like the tenant or to be difficult, or as more common is the case, to extract a payment, well, that's just unreasonable, Rosie.
Well, that seems fair enough. So let's talk about the practical process. If a tenant wants to make alterations, what should they do? First, check the lease thoroughly. What does the alterations covenant say? Is it absolute, qualified, or fully qualified? Does it distinguish between the different types of alterations? Structural, non-structural, internal, external. Some leases have different regimes for different categories of works.
Yes, and are there specific requirements in the lease? For example, some leases require that all works be carried out by contractors approved by the landlord, or the tenant must use the landlord's surveyor to supervise the works, or that works can only be done during certain hours to avoid disturbing other occupiers. These requirements are part of the tenant's contractual obligations, so they will need to comply with them.
Second, prepare a proper, comprehensive application for consent. Now, this is really important. A half-baked application will just lead to delays, additional costs, and frustration. What you will typically need as a tenant is architectural drawings or plans showing what you propose to do, full specification for the works, detailing materials, methods of construction, and so on, details of the contractors who will carry them out, including evidence of their qualifications, insurance, and their experience.
Yeah, and tenants will also need evidence of any necessary planning permissions or listed building consents if it's applicable. If the property is in a conservation area or it's listed, the tenant may need special consents even for the internal works, and they'll need building regulation approval for anything that affects the structure, the fire safety, drainage, or certain other regulated matters. Don't assume building regulations don't apply just because it's an internal alteration, because they often do.
Tenants should also provide method statements showing how the works will be executed without causing damage or disruption. This is particularly important in multi-let buildings. How will the tenant protect the common parts? How will they manage noise and dust? What are the working hours? Will they need to turn off the services? These are all legitimate concerns for landlords and the other occupiers of the building.
Then the tenant needs to formally apply for the landlord's consent. This is usually called a license to alter or a license for alterations. The request should be in writing with all the supporting documents attached. It should be addressed to the landlord and their managing agent if the property is professionally managed. And tenants need to keep a copy of everything sent and get proof of delivery. It helps us litigators when things go wrong. I'm going to mention something that's not particularly relevant in relation to consents under alteration covenants, but which does relate to consents under alienation covenants, which we're going to discuss in the 5th podcast in the series. And this is something that we see being mentioned time and again by solicitors and agents. I
think I know what this one will be.
What is it?
It's the Landlord and Tenant Act 1988.
It is indeed. Yeah, that's right. So under Section 1 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1988, when a tenant requests consent to assign or underlet or charging or parting with possession, it requires the landlord's consent under the lease. The landlord must respond within a reasonable time. Section 1 of the Landlord and Tenant Act 1988 plays no role in applications for consent to undertake alterations. None at all. It's only relevant when it comes to alienation.
So, where the tenant makes their application for consent to alter, the landlord is typically entitled to charge the tenant for their reasonable surveyors and solicitors' costs of dealing with that application. This will usually be set out in the lease, and there'll be a clause saying something along the lines of, the tenant shall pay the landlord's reasonable costs and expenses incurred in connection with any application for consent. The costs should be reasonable, but for a straightforward application, you're looking at between $1,500 to $3,000 in professional fees. For more complex works with significant structural alterations, fit-outs, works requiring detailed review by structural engineers or other specialists, this could be significantly more. We've seen cases where the landlord's costs run to $10,000 or $15,000 for very complex projects, so the tenant needs to factor this into their budgeting. It's not just the cost of the works, it's the cost of getting permission as well.
Yeah. So now, assuming consent is granted, the tenant needs to comply with any conditions attached to the consent. These will typically be set out in that formal license to alter document that I mentioned. Common conditions include carrying out the work strictly in accordance with the approved drawings and specifications using the approved contractors and not changing them without consent and not starting work until all satisfactory approvals are in place.
Yeah. Other typical conditions include maintaining adequate insurance during the works, including employer's liability, public liability, and contractors' or risks insurance, notifying the landlord before starting the works, and allowing the landlord or the surveyor to inspect at reasonable times. You'll need to carry out the works in a good and workmanlike manner and make good any damage to any parts of the building.
And crucially, providing the landlord with as-built drawings when the works are completed. as-built drawings show what was actually constructed as opposed to what was planned. During construction, things often change. Pipework routes get adjusted, electrical layouts are modified, structural elements are slightly different from the original design. The as-built drawings record the final position.
Yeah, these drawings are crucial if there are any disputes later about what was actually built, or if the tenant needs to reinstate at the end of the lease. Without as-built drawings, it can be very difficult to establish exactly what works were done and what would be required to remove them. So make sure your contractors prepare them and make sure you provide them to the landlord as required by the terms of the license to alter.
Which brings us to the big topic for this episode, the reinstatement. This is one of the biggest financial risks for tenants, and it sometimes comes as a nasty shock to them at the end of the lease.
Think it's best if we paint a scenario. So, you're a business tenant. You've taken a lease of a shell unit. Bare concrete floors, brick walls, basic services, the dream. You fit it out at a cost of £200,000. You install suspended ceilings, partitioning to create offices and meeting rooms, a kitchen, toilets, flooring, decorations, lighting, aircon, IT, cabling, the lot. You occupy the premises for 5 years. Your business is successful, but then circumstances change. You're consolidating onto another site, or you're moving to a bigger location. Or you're being taken over. Doesn't matter, you want to leave. You serve notice to end the lease, or you're coming up to the end of the contractual term, and the landlord says, right, pursuant to clause such and such of the lease, you need to remove all these alterations and reinstate the premises to shell condition. Suddenly, you're facing a reinstatement bill that could run to £50,000, possibly £100,000 or more.
Yeah, and the cost of removing the fit-out is often significantly less than the cost of installing it, but it's still substantial. And you've got to strip out the partitioning, remove the suspended ceilings, take out the kitchen and the toilet fittings, remove the floor coverings, cap off electricals and data points, possibly remove the air conditioning unit if the tenant's installations rather than landlords, and make good any holes and damage and leave the premises clean and tidy. And for a large unit with extensive fit-out, £50,000 to £100,000 is entirely realistic.
Whether the tenant has to reinstate depends entirely on the lease. Many leases contain what's called a reinstatement covenant, which requires the tenant at the end of the lease to remove any alterations or additions and make good. The wording varies enormously from lease to lease, so you absolutely must read your specific lease very carefully, but it might say something along the lines of, at the expiry or sooner determination of the term, to remove any alterations or additions made during the term, whether with or without the landlord's consent, and to reinstate the premises to their original condition and make good all damage caused by such removal.
The key questions are, does the covenant apply to all alterations or only to those made without consent? Does it apply to all categories of alterations or only certain types? Perhaps only structural alterations or only non-structural alterations? Does it apply automatically or only if the landlord serves notice requiring a reinstatement? And if notice is required, what's the time limit for serving it?
Every lease is different and the details matter enormously. Some leases say reinstatement is only required for unauthorised alterations, as in those done without consent. In that case, if you've got a proper license to alter and it doesn't contain a reinstatement condition, you don't have to reinstate. Other leases say reinstatement is required for all alterations, whether authorised or not. That is much more onerous for the tenant.
And some leases distinguish between different categories. They might say structural alterations must always be reinstated. Non-structural alterations need only be reinstated if the landlord serves notice requiring reinstatement, such notice to be served not later than, say, 3 months before the end of the term. That gives the tenant some certainty. They know structural works will always need to be removed, but they'll get warning about non-structural works, and if the landlord doesn't serve notice in time, they don't have to reinstate them.
Now, here's a really important practical tip for tenants. And this is something I cannot stress enough. Negotiate the reinstatement obligation when you are taking the lease, not at the end when you want to leave. If you know you'll need to fit out the premises extensively, and most business tenants normally do, address reinstatement up front. Try to agree that reinstatement won't be required at all, or it will only be required for certain specified works. Or if it is required, the landlord has to serve a notice and can demonstrate that removal is necessary for reletting.
And from the landlord's perspective, they may well be willing to agree to this, but they'll usually want something in return, perhaps a higher rent, because they're taking the risk that the alterations won't suit a future tenant and they'll have to pay to remove them or to reconfigure them. Or perhaps a lump sum payment at the start to compensate for the flexibility, or perhaps the landlord will agree to take the premises as they are at the end, but at a reduced rent for any rent-free period of holding over.
But whatever you agree, get it documented properly. It needs to be in the lease itself, or at least in a formal side letter that's disclosed to future purchasers of the reversion, or in a license to alter when it's granted. Don't rely on verbal assurances or informal emails, because they are not binding on future landlords if the reversion is sold, and they're often forgotten or conveniently lost or disputed by the time the end of the lease comes around, perhaps 10 or 15 years later.
Indeed. And another approach might be to seek comfort from the landlord at the time that you're carrying out the works. When you're applying for the license to alter, you can ask the landlord to confirm in the license whether reinstatement will be required. If the works are things that most future tenants would want, modern toilet facilities, good quality kitchen, efficient layouts, the landlord might be willing to confirm that reinstatement won't be required because they'll benefit from the improvements when they come to relet.
But be careful. Unless it's documented properly in a legally binding way, these assurances may not be enforceable, particularly if the landlord sells a reversion to someone else who isn't bound by informal understandings. So if you do get comfort from the landlord, make sure it's recorded in the license to alter itself. It is clear, unambiguous terms that will bind successors in title. One final point I did want to flag in relation to reinstatement is the impact of reinstatement obligations on a break. So if you have the benefit of a break right within your lease, that right is likely to be subject to a requirement to give vacant possession. Now, vacant possession is generally understood to mean people, but it also means possessions, and that can extend to some alterations. So if your alterations are deemed to be so insubstantial that they could be better described as tenant fittings, then they need to come out. It might help to give you an example. So there's a case, Riverside Park and NHS from 2016. The NHS had taken a lease of a large space and installed a mass of partitions to create a rabbit warren of rooms and wards. They served their break notice and happily vacated all the patients and staff prior to the break date, thinking vacant possession had been given. Tick. However, they failed to remove the partitions they had installed. The break date came, and the landlord successfully argued that the partitions substantially interfered with the landlord's right to possess and use their property. In short, because the condition of giving vacant possession was not met, the break clause was invalid. The lease remained in effect, and the tenant was liable for continued rent and obligations.
Oh dear. Well, we've covered some very technical points today, Rosie. Next time on the Commercial Property Insights, we'll be looking at full repair and insuring leases versus internal repairing and insuring leases. We'll be looking at repair and schedule of conditions. Also, interim schedules of dilapidations if you're taking on a lease midterm. And disrepair, well, it's a hotbed for disputes, so we'll have plenty to discuss.
Until next time, thanks for listening to Commercial Property Insights from Davis Blank Furness. If you've got questions on anything we've covered today, get in touch by visiting our website, www.dbf-law.co.uk. Take care.